How's it going, everyone? This is James from James Films, and today I wanted to walk you through how to make a really cool arches, kind of surreal landscape scene. I did something like this a couple weeks ago and people really seemed to like it. I used a lot of Quixel Megascans assets to kind of build out some of the rocks and textures in the scene. But for this one, I kind of wanted to show you how to make it without using any external assets and just using stuff that's already in Blender, specifically Blender Kit. It comes with Blender, and if you don't already have it enabled, go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, Install. Oops, sorry, you don't actually need to go install. It's already in here. Just type in Blender Kit, and there it is, the Blender Kit Online Asset Library, and you'll just click Check to enable that, and welcome to Blender Kit. Save preferences, and it will now be there. And you see you get all these great textures and things, and to access this, you can just open up this menu on the right side here, and there is Blender Kit. And you have great models and materials. You can search by free only, and specifically go through categories and things. Look, you got all kinds of great stuff like a low poly human, an air conditioner unit, and even a Marvel Quinjet if you're into that. So lots of great stuff in here. I use this from time to time for architectural elements like chairs or couches and things that I don't feel like modeling for the scene, that I just need to fill out a landscape or an environment. So we'll be accessing that today to do our tutorial. So let me actually start a new one here, because sometimes the Blender Kit gets in the way of the top bar, which is kind of a little bit annoying. But we have our scene here, and the first thing I actually want you to do is pull down here, so you have this extra little menu here. Click this drop down, and then go to Image Editor. And I have included an image from Wikipedia of Arches National Park that we're going to be using as a reference for our image here. So you can just open that image up, and it will be now in here on Blender, so you can use this as a reference. I highly recommend using references when you're making environmental renders, because you might think you know what a mountain looks like or what a rock formation looks like, but just kind of modeling off of memory won't get you the kind of results that look realistic. Actually having an image of a real scene next to you can really help with your photorealism and really defining a good look for the scene. So I'm going to keep this up on the right as we model out this arch. And it's a really simple process, and it begins by deleting everything here. So I'm actually going to delete the default cube. I like to keep it sometimes and try to build up the scenes with it, but let's delete it. And instead, let's add in a torus, open up this little drop-down window down here, and let's add in an even number of major and minor segments just for simplicity here when we're doing some subdivisions. I'm going to tab into edit mode and then hit R, Y to constrain my rotation to the Y axis, hit 90, and then now we have a torus sitting on its side here. You can scale this up just a little bit if you want by hitting S on your keyboard and then pulling up a little bit. So now we have a slightly larger scene. Now I'm going to hit 3 on my numpad. So we're looking at this edge on. And so what we actually want to do is click on this little layer thing you see up here, which is going to toggle the X-ray mode. So now you're actually selecting faces that are both in front and behind your object here. And just drag with your mouse and select up until right below this one that's sitting on that Y-axis, that green axis there. So you have everything now selected. If I just kind of pan around here, you see we are selecting the entirety of this torus, and just hit X and then delete those vertices. So now we're left with this just rainbow arch thing here, a half torus. So this is what we're going to be using to make the arch. It's pretty simple. And we can actually go over to our modifiers tab now and add in just another level of subdivision just to work with that. Let's make it 2 in the viewport just so we have a little bit more geometry to work with. Add in a displace deform modifier, and I'll scroll down here, hit new. Let's just pull this up here a bit so you can see it. And what we're going to do is actually click on this little slider thing here, and it accesses our texture edit mode. And we're going to hit this drop down and select clouds. So this looks pretty wacky, and that is because the size of the clouds, that is what you're seeing down here, is really small. So you're going to want to drag this up, and you're going to see that's going to become a little bit more realistic and rocky looking. Let's see, just pick something that you're happy with here. I'm going to select something like, I don't know, let's say 0.9, and this still looks really blocky. So what I'm going to do is actually just right click and shade smooth. So now this looks a bit more like rocks, but we're not seeing kind of this a bit of unevenness to it. So you can see some erosions kind of knocked out a little bit of this face here. This part here is like a little bit jagged too, to a certain degree. This part's a little bit maybe more vertical. And we're just currently looking at something that looks way too uniform. So what we're going to actually do is go into edit mode, but before we do that, you can keep the displace on. You'll notice when we go into edit mode, you actually don't see anything here, and that is because you want to select this edit mode, display modifier in edit mode here. Now we actually see what it will look like. And this will just help us a little bit as we're defining our sculpting here a bit. And instead of actually using the sculpt mode brushes, what I want to actually use is proportional editing. And that's enabled by clicking this little circle kind of hidden up here. This is really awesome to enable. And I'm just going to keep in vertex mode. If you're not already in vertex mode, you might be in face or edge mode. Just hit 1, and this will take you in to be able to select vertices. Just click on any one of these vertices up here, and let's actually, let's start with this little right edge here, kind of pulling that in. So I'm just going to click on one of these random vertices and then hit G to grab. And you get this circle here. And you can control the size of the circle by scrolling up, this is up to kind of make it smaller, or down with the scroll wheel on your mouse. And you'll notice that now I'm affecting all of these vertices when I'm pulling and pushing this thing in here. So I'm just going to push this in just a little bit here. You can go to maybe 3 if you want to see from the side here what this will look like. So now we're kind of pushing this in, and to kind of compensate, let's pull these guys up here a bit. I can select this overall thing here, maybe scale this up quite a bit and kind of pull our geometry all the way up here. So now we're kind of matching a bit more the height of Arches National Park. Let's make this a little bit smaller. This is just a lot of experimentation. Have some fun with this. You don't need to copy exactly what I'm doing. In fact, I don't want you to copy exactly what I'm doing. I want you to take the time to really understand how this tool works, experiment around with things, and give your own twist to it, give your own spin to whatever we're working with here. So I'm noticing that this top part's pretty flat. You can kind of see a little bit of stratification to the layers. They're almost perfectly horizontal to a certain extent. If you want to see through this, you can turn on the X-ray mode again. And let's just really flatten these top parts out a bit there. Again, referencing the model, this part kind of pulls down a little bit here and a little bit inward. And then this part kind of goes up a bit. So let's pull that up a bit. This part's even skinnier maybe, so let's go over here. Select one of these vertices, that's fine probably. And pull this in a bit. And then pull this guy in a bit. Really want to pull this one in a bit. This displacement's kind of looking a bit crazy, so we might actually apply this. You can see you're somewhat limited with the displacement. You can kind of see you're still going to have these weird bulbous elements, and that's being driven by that cloud texture over here. So what we might actually do at this point, this is looking pretty good. I think this already looks fairly close to what we're looking for with this Arches model. And I'm going to be able to refine this a bit further actually in sculpt mode. So what I'm actually going to do is just hit Shift D, copy this. So I just have a copy of this to work with. And you can hit M and New Collection, and just move this to a collection, let's call it Trash. So we're just going to move that to there. And then you can click this here to exclude it from the viewed layer. So now that's hidden, because I'm going to be actually committing these changes, and just in case we wanted to go back and adjust our geometry later, we still have that saved version, because the changes I'm about to make here are in fact final. This is my final answer. I'm going to be locking this in. So you can click on this drop down and hit apply on our subdivision first, and then apply our displacement modifier. So now we've committed this, and you can see this is what our geometry now looks like. You can see there's a lot more because that subdivision surface added in a little bit of extra geometry to the scene, but do not be afraid. This is all well and good. So I'm just going to go into sculpt mode here and scroll down to, let's go to the smooth brush first. And let's just kind of like smooth out some of these weird jagged bumps, especially up on the top here. I kind of wanted this to be a little bit flatter. And now you're seeing we're losing a lot of that definition. And to bring some of that back, I'll usually like to use like the inflate brush to kind of pull up a little bit of kind of weird parts. Scale this up and down by hitting F and then pulling on your mouse. Just pull your mouse to the right to scale it up. Push your mouse to the left to scale this way down. And then you can hit actually Shift F, and this kind of defines the fall off of the brush. So 1 is just completely everything's having the same exact influence. 0 is just totally that one point in the middle here. So I like to usually keep this at somewhere in between, like let's say like, I don't know, 0.6, 0.5. That's probably fine. You can kind of add this up and down, and I just keep pulling and pushing with F to kind of scale this up and down. You can hit Shift actually with any brush to use it as kind of like the inverse or the smooth of it. So what I'm going to do is these edges over here, they're a little bit too blocked out, so I'm going to hit Shift as I'm clicking to kind of smooth these in a bit and make it look a little bit more like what we're seeing with that arch on the right there. Again, just take your time with this, have fun, you know, just have at it and really enjoy sculpting. And I'm not a master of sculpting by any stretch, but you know, you kind of know enough to just be able to have fun and move things around here and adjust things. pull and push. It's fairly straightforward, and just with a little bit of practice, you kind of get used to deforming some of this geometry and making sure that you're keeping good geometry throughout. So I might speed this process up a bit in the final video so you're not watching me doing this over and over. And if this is going too fast for you, feel free to pause, take some time to go through and just sculpt out and have fun with it. Cool. So that is our arch for now. Might come back and make some more modifications to this in a bit, but at least for right now, I think this is looking pretty good. So let's start blocking out the rest of the scene here. What I usually like to do is kind of set my camera angle early, just so I have an idea of what I'm working with, and then kind of work off that. So let's do like somewhat to this side here from about this distance. And if you already have a camera in your scene, you can hit Control, Alt, and 0, and this defines whatever viewpoint you're currently looking at as the camera's viewpoint, the active camera's viewpoint. And for Instagram, I usually like to go for a resolution of 1200 on the X by 1500 on the Y. Let's actually go over into rendered mode for Eevee. Usually I like to look dev in Eevee, especially if you're using kind of a slower computer. I now have one that's very souped up that I built recently, but before I was working off my laptop, which was not the best, so it would usually kill me a little bit if I was working in Cycle. So I tried to do a lot of my look dev in Eevee, just because it's real time, doesn't need as much going on with it to operate. So let's make our right side of the viewpoint the rendered view. And when you actually do the Control Alt 0 technique, sometimes it rotates your camera like a little bit on either the Y or Z axis here. So I'm just going to zero out that Y rotation. Some really great useful things to have when you're doing this is to go over to your camera, hit viewport display, and then actually, it's kind of hidden here on my screen, but I'm just opening this up here. Composition guides, hit on center and rule of thirds. And this gives you some nice layout. You can also turn this up a little bit here too to just be focusing on what's in the screen. I think it's just very helpful to have that as you're developing things out because you get a better idea for composition where things should be. I tend to have things at these intersection points here, something in the center. Just kind of helps when you're trying to figure out where to draw the viewer's eye into your screen. So I'm just hitting G and Z to constrain the motion of the camera on this one axis to kind of move it down just a little bit here. Maybe let's just rotate it just a little bit here so it's kind of more a bit even. Again, we can always come back and do more of this later, but I just want to have an initial idea of what I'm working with. I'm going to pull up this bottom menu here because we're going to be starting to do a little bit of shading in just a second. So I'm just going to turn this on to shader mode. But for the first part here, let's actually go over to our world tab, hit this yellow circle here, environment texture, and then let's import an HDRI. And I've linked the one I've used in the description for this video. So now we have some lighting to our scene. And if you go over to the shading tab and click down on world, you'll be able to actually change the positioning of this, especially if you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. I feel like every Blender YouTuber always harps on having this enabled, but it really is helpful just for very quickly doing some shading with nodes. So click on just this image texture of the sky here and then hit Control and T. And now you have a mapping and texture coordinate node hooked up to your HDRI. And you can just scroll around on the rotation on the Z-axis to roll this around. And so what I'm going to do is look for where the sun is really hitting that edge of the arch really well. I kind of like how the sun's hitting this right edge here at around 120 degrees. I think that looks pretty good. Can maybe increase the strength of it just a little bit here. But what you'll start to notice is the issue with HDRIs and just lighting solely with them is if you ramp up the strength of the brightness, it begins to wash out your scene. So you can't control the single point of light. It's just lighting up everything in the image. You know, you maybe want to just brighten up where the sun is coming from over here, but you can't do that. So what I'd like to do actually is light with both an HDRI and let's hit Shift A and add in a sun lamp. And what I try to do with the sun lamp is match the directionality of where the maximum point of light is coming from the image. In this case, it is the sun. Sometimes it might be the moon or something. But let's hit R and then X to constrain this motion to the X-axis here. And then R, Shift Z to just have it on the XY plane. And we can rotate this around. And now you're seeing that sunlight starting to take effect there. Let's actually just ramp up the strength to really see what we're doing with this. So that is where the sunlight is hitting. And this just gives us better shadows. It just, I think, is helpful to really illuminate the image. And especially if, let me just add in a plane here for our ground and scale this up quite a bit. So we have this plane in now for our ground. You can see the shadow of the arch now taking effect on there. While I have this plane up, let me just subdivide it a couple times and then give it maybe 45 cuts here, just so we've got some geometry to work with for that in a second, because we're going to be wanting to make our ground plane momentarily. So we've got our lighting here. Let me just add a little bit of a subtle orangish tint to this for that kind of late sunset atmosphere to it. And let's bring down the strength just a little bit. We don't need it as crazy for right now. So we've got our arch basically done here. While I'm working here, I can maybe go back to viewport shading, just if your render is going a little bit slowly for you. Let's click on this plane here. And we're going to add in another layer of subdivision here. We don't need as much. Let's just put it to 1 and 1 for both the viewport and the render. Add a displacement modifier. And let's also add a clouds one for this. But ramp up the scale quite a bit. Let's add the scale to like 7 or something. So now you kind of see the sloping, if I turn off the overlays here, got this kind of like nice sloping effect to it. And we can kind of define that a little bit further by going into sculpt mode and kind of pulling up on parts of the image. We don't need maybe that much to it. Kind of pulling up on parts, especially around these arches. I kind of want it to be matching, as you see here in this image, kind of flowing in with the ground a bit. And again, use shift to kind of push these things up and down. I really think the inflate brush is the one I probably use the most for doing landscape stuff, because it's very easy to quickly kind of bubble up little divots and things and push things down. I just think it really is helpful to define things very quickly. And oftentimes I'll end up actually putting stuff over these bumps. It's just kind of give me an idea of the composition of the scene. And then you can kind of bring in rock assets, maybe photo scans or something from Quixel, or your own assets to kind of cover up those parts there. But this is just kind of helpful to figure out like with things in your scene. So I'm just going to do a little bit more work here. We kind of want to have maybe some leading line here pulling your eye into the frame. So I'm going to push down on this a little bit here. Maybe let's go to edit mode and actually proportional editing. Go to our camera view and then pull down a bit here. So we kind of have this like nice leading line, maybe some kind of hiking trail or something, taking us into the scene. And again, have fun experimenting with this. Do whatever you think looks good for your scene that you're working on. So now we've got the basic ground defined for our plane. Let's go back into render view just to see what we're working with. And I'm actually going to click once to lower this down, so we're just seeing more of the sky and not as much of that background there, just for coloration purposes. And let's actually start to put some textures and shading on here, so we've got an idea for what we're working with. I'm going to open up Blender Kit here, go to the materials, and just type in, let's say, a rock. This will take a second to load up. We've got a couple rocks to choose from. Scroll through here and see what the options are. We've got a couple different things, and you can always just define the colors in here and change things later when you actually import these in. They'll come up as a nice already connected node network for you to work with. It just kind of saves you some time, so you don't have to make your own textures or import things in. It's just nice to kind of work off this. So let's see. Maybe we can work with this like sandstone too here. Let's click on that and add it to the ground plane. Okay, so now we've got our texture loaded in here. You can see it's all connected up and looks pretty cool. Got some different things to work with. We can always tap in here. Oops, did not mean to do that. You can always tap in here to the base color. It's using some kind of image texture for that. So just kind of get your bearings with the texture, what you're working with, what you can change, what you cannot change with it. And let's actually just unwrap this plane for a second here, just so it is using the proper UV. And same thing for this. Tab in edit mode, hit A, U, and then unwrap. This will take a second because there's a lot of geometry. And Blender not responding. There's quite a lot of geometry going on here. You can listen to the dog barking outside my window now instead, while this is loading. And now we have that loaded up. So let's tab out edit mode and let's actually add that same sandstone texture to this. You see it looks awful, so let's actually do a smart UV project on this, and I feel like that looks a bit better. So we've got some nice textures going on here. This one is probably a little bit too stretched for what it should be, so tab in edit mode, switch this to the texture node editor, or sorry, to the UV editor rather. Hit Control A to select all the points here, S, and then you can scale this up a bit so that this texture is becoming a bit smaller on the screen, because we want this to look a little bit more natural in this setting. And you'll notice that our reference image is obviously much redder than what we're seeing here. So to do some changes here, let's add in, since we're basing this off an image texture, let's add in a hue saturation node. And let's mess with the hue a little bit here to kind of change this to like a redder color. Something like this, like 0.45 looks pretty good. Kind of maybe change a little bit with the value here. Maybe saturated like a little bit more here, so we got this kind of redder texture going on. So that's looking pretty decent to begin with, I think. We've got kind of this nice looking scene going on here. But I feel like it's kind of missing a little bit. This is a little bit too bright, I think. The specularity is a little bit too bright on that, so let's just pull this down a bit. That's looking a little bit better, I think. Maybe let's just turn this all the way off. That kind of looks a bit better. Now that this is a little bit too saturated, let's pull the saturation back a hair. Maybe 1.4. This is all a pull and push here. Let me just save this out here just so we have this as well. It's always helpful to save things. Oops. Arches tutorial. Always be saving along the way. And also, I forgot to do this as well too, but I think it's helpful to always name your layers so you know what you're working with, especially when you start adding in tons and tons of extra layers to your scene. So this plane here, I'm just going to call the ground layer. We don't have a lot of layers going on right now. And this torus, let's just call it the arch. So we have those nice and labeled here. And what I'm going to do now is actually add in some rocks scattered around this ground plane here. And to do that, there's actually an interesting add-on in Blender, extra objects, mesh. And you can enable those extra objects, and then now you'll have in the mesh section these rock generator here. I believe that's what it is. Let's see, rock. I think that's what it is. Yeah, I believe that's what it comes in. I've already had this enabled from before, but if you don't, it might be that. You can hit rock generator, and now this adds in rocks with some interesting textures to them. You can keep clicking this to the right to add a couple more. So let's add in 3 different kinds of rocks. And you can do all kinds of different things with the deformation with them. This kind of changes some things with the texture that's adding to the displacement of these rocks. So you can see that's what's going on there. Add in a bit of roughness to kind of mess these around and change around with them too. So we've got some rocks here. And while these are all selected, I'm just going to hit M and add them to a new collection called them rocks. Let's move them off to the side for now, and we can just look at these up a bit closer as well to see what they are. So here are our rocks. You can see if I go over to the modifiers tab, they've got a couple subdivisions and then some displacements added onto them to add them a little bit of detail to them, because they're all basing this off of a cube, it appears, and kind of deforming them in different ways. So while I have these selected, let's add in those sandstone textures to each of these so they match in well with our scene. Just by clicking on them and then adding in those materials. So now they all have the sandstone material. Let's go back over to our plane here and zoom out a bit and go to the particles tab and then hit plus icon to create a new particle system. We'll call this one the rocks particle system. Let's make it a hair emitter. Now you see all these little hair particles coming off here. And what you want to do is actually go down to render and render as collection. And for the collection, we're going to select the rocks one here. So now you see it's rendering all these rocks, but that looks really fake because there's no randomness to anything here. So the scale randomness is at 0, so you want to pull this up a bit. It's going to randomize that scale and actually go up and hit advanced. And this now gives us the option of adjusting the rotation of our particles. I'm going to set this to normal so that it's normal to the surface of the displaced plane. And let's just also randomize this as well too while we're at it. Why not? You can kind of mess around with these and see what works for you, what works for your scene. I think the scale of these particles is maybe a little bit too high, so I'm going to maybe bring this down a little bit here. And let's just ramp up the number of them quite a bit here. So we have like 3,200. But what you'll notice is there's a whole lot of particles behind in places where we're not even going to see in our scene. So to kind of adjust with this, we can actually add in a vertex group to define where the planes are coming from, or where the points are coming from, rather. So to do that, I'm going to go down and open up this vertex group, and you'll have this density one that you can define. And the way to do that is actually to go to here, this little triangle, and then make a new vertex group. And let's just call this our rocks group. So now let's go into weight paint And you can just start kind of painting in where you want the particles to be. And now let me actually go back and add that vertex group to our density. And now you'll see the particles are just being emitted from that one area there instead of the whole scene. You can kind of keep painting this around, and you can see it's actually emitting from the vertices, so this looks super strange. So if it's doing that, let's go up and hit source, and then just hit, let's see, how do we randomize this? A bit more. This is looking way too even. Let's see, you want like some kind of randomness to this. But we do not want even distribution. That's what's somehow checked on. Random. There we go. That's what it was. I always forget this. Jittered is not what we want. We want random distribution. So now that looks more natural. And have it selected from volume. Yeah. Okay, so now this is randomized. We can kind of keep painting in here and doing different things. So now we have our rocks like all over our scene here. There may be a bit too many of these. Let's just bring this down again to like 1200 or something. So now this looks a little bit more natural, I think. So what's the next step here? So let's see. Let's add in, from one of these renders I did before, I added in some chairs into this scene, just because I kind of want to ground this like a little bit in reality a bit. So let's actually go over to models, check on free only, and add in a chair. So we can scroll through here. We've got a couple options for different chairs. We're going to try to find one that kind of matches a bit with our scene here and looks like it could be just a random like outdoor chair or something that would sit in this environment. There's quite a lot to choose from, which is always fun. I always find this really nice for ArchViz projects. You've got like tons and tons of different chairs to choose from for the scene. So let's choose this, like maybe this brown wooden chair. You can put this in the scene. So we've got this little chair here. And let's just pull this up so it kind of fits in this archway. Hit rotate on the x-axis. So now we've got this little chair that's there. It looks kind of cool. And let's give it some company. Let's hit Alt-D and give it another one. Alt-D is to instance this object. Since it's already a collection, it doesn't really matter. But for other objects, you might want to instance this. I talked about this in other videos, so you're not adding all kinds of extra geometry into your scene. And just kind of fit this so it looks like it would be naturally also in this environment here. Could be helpful where you turn on the guides to kind of see what should be placed where, get some kind of evenness to the scene. So we've got our chairs now in our environment. This is kind of cool. But I think the background is looking a little bit strange to me. And there's a couple things to do here. You could actually add in a landscape to the scene by actually importing some kind of displacement map for something that you've built elsewhere. Like I use something called World Creator a lot to build mountains and stuff for my scenes. But Blender's got this great built-in landscape mesh pack here. So just to keep everything in Blender, I'm just going to add in a landscape. And they've got a bunch of different presets that you can use by clicking this operator presets dropdown. You can kind of tab through some of these. Let's zoom in to see what this is doing. So you've got this canyon one here, which might fit well for the theme of our render. You've got all these mountains in the background, so you can find something that looks like this. There are mountain selection here, mountain 1, mountain 2. So that looks like it could be kind of interesting. Oops, let's go to, let's see, ridged, see what this does. This looks decent too. So we can kind of experiment with a couple of these and kind of layer them up. So this ridged one looks like it could be interesting for these background mountains here. So let me just scroll out here a bit and scale this guy up. In edit mode, pull this way back here, pull it down a bit. And if you're getting clipping here, if this is going outside of your screen, click on your camera, go down to the camera tab, and then see this clip start and clip end. It's defaulted to 100 meters, at least for me. Just give it something ridiculous, like, I don't know, some insane amount of 9s. It's never gonna cap off. So now you see this just goes fading into oblivion in the distance. So we've got our landscape here. Let's add that same sandstone texture to it as well. Let's actually UV unwrap this so it matches a bit better with it. So it looks a bit better, I think, over there. And what you can do now, since this is what I was talking about with the duplicating instances, if you just hit Shift D, it just duplicates exactly that geometry. So you've got another one to work with of it. If you're satisfied with how this looks and you kind of just want to place a whole bunch of these around, I think it's helpful to hit Alt-D. So you're doing an instance of this, and you actually can't change this one's geometry anymore. whenever you change this one's geometry, you're actually changing the geometry for both of these planes. So just keep that in mind. It affects both of them, but it just gives you like a lot less geometry to work with in your scene, so you're not going to be bogging it down as much when you're rendering. And since these things are so far in the distance, you're not even going to really notice them anyway, that they're from the exact same plane, the exact same object. So we can just kind of mess around and kind of work with these. So let's just pull this over here, and I'm actually going to go into proportional editing mode and pull these faces down here to kind of make this mountain fit in a bit more with the landscape. Maybe don't need it down that much. So that looks pretty good. Let's just duplicate another one of these, scale this up on the Z-axis, pull this around. It's looking a little bit too crazy, rugged. Pull this down as well on the side. Again, this is just a lot of your own personal taste, just how you want these things to look. You just be pulling and pushing with these and moving things around, rotating things, scaling things, moving objects all over the place. I think it's just helpful to just take the time with this and really just have fun with it and see what you can make. Make it look interesting, make it look realistic, kind of match your references if you're going for that. I'm trying to match this to some degree of similarity. So now we've got this kind of crazy cool looking scene with all kinds of stuff going on in the background there. But the sky is not really matching for me, it's not really doing it, I think. So if I were to actually maybe swap this sky out with something else, we can try that and see what works. You can also mess a bit with the sun too. Let's maybe crank up this intensity a bit. Not liking that as much. Let's bring it down a bit. Looks a bit better. Have it maybe coming from that side a bit more there. So let's actually add in like a different sky back here. So what I'm going to do is go to film this drop down and make this transparent in the background. And so now, if you don't already have this add-on enabled, go to Edit Preferences, and then your add-on is Images as Planes. And so you're going to want to check this on and then save your preferences out. Now what you can do is actually go to Shift A and then Image, and you'll have this new option here, Images as Planes. And you're going to check on Emit here, and I've got a whole bunch of skies and stuff to work with. I'm going to try to find something that matches well with the coloring of my render here, so I'm going to keep that in mind. It's kind of this like early evening sunset type look, and I'll link whatever image I use here in the description as well for you to use. I just think this is nice to do already. And here you could always comp this in later if you wanted in Photoshop or something, but it's helpful to already have the lighting in here because the emission from this plane will actually impact the lighting on your objects in your scene. So it looks even more realistic to do this in Blender instead of in Post. So I've got a couple images here. Let's see, which one should I choose? This is always kind of tricky, and I can always go back here and swap out with a different one, but maybe let's choose this one, Morocco here, which has kind of got this like mountainous looking thing to it. This kind of washed out purplish looking color. I can just shift this all the way back here and pull it up. Let's scale it up quite a bit. So we've got it way back here. You want to make sure it fills up the entire screen. So that looks pretty good to me. Maybe rotate it a bit. Pull it in to make sure it's not capping at all. So now let's click on this, and you can see it's added in this plane as an emission texture, so you can actually adjust the emission of this a bit to brighten it up a bit if you wanted. I think that kind of looks good. Let's pull this up a bit. So we got our mountains in here, and there's now 2 layers of mountains. And if you're actually rendering this in either Eevee or Cycles, what this is actually impacting is the lighting from your sunlight. So if I were to really show what is happening here, let me go to the sun and just really ramp up the brightness of this to like 100, and then like let's rotate this around a bit. This plane is actually blocking the sun if I show you to a certain degree here. So what is actually needed to be done, let me just undo that, in Eevee at least, is to go to Options, and then you want to hit Shadow Mode to None. And then in Cycles, if I were to switch this to Cycles Render, you want to actually go to this when you're selected on the image, the Object Data Properties, or Object Properties, and then go down to Visibility, and then you want uncheck Ray Visibility for Shadow. So now that's not impacting the sunlight anymore. So should we render this in cycles or Eevee? Well, you can get a pretty similar look in both of these, at least for external renders, I think, to a certain degree. I'm going to opt for cycles for this one just because I think it looks a little bit nicer, but feel free to render in Eevee, kind of play around with the lighting a bit as you see fit. Now at this point, what I want to do is actually add in a little bit of atmosphere to this. And there's a couple ways of doing this. I'm going to have a better video where I go into more detail. Someone on my Patreon actually just asked to have a really nice in-depth volumetric tutorial. So I'm going to start making one soon to go through and show you all the different techniques that I use to get nice atmosphere in my renders. I talked about it a little bit in some previous videos, but I want to go into even greater detail to really show you guys exactly how I do this. So let's try one technique here by scaling up a cube in the foreground of the scene. And I'm going to turn off its visibility, or going to make its viewport display as wired. So now you can actually see it here. You can actually see your scene here. And I'm going to name this up here, call it volume, and add in a new texture. Let's delete the principled BSDF and make this a principled volume texture. If I plug this into the volume now, you can see it looks way too dense. So let's pull down this density from 1 to like 0.05. So now you've got this nice kind of volumetric atmosphere to it. If you ramp up this color a little bit more, it brightens up your scene. You can give it kind of like a dusty-ish orange coloring to it. And this is getting like a little bit washed out. We're kind of losing a lot of the detail. So I kind of maybe don't want this affecting as close in the foreground. So I can kind of pull this back a little bit here. Maybe even turn the density down to like 0.02. Just because that haze is kind of nice in the distance. So if you wanted, you can render this out, but the issue with volumetrics is it really will slow down your render times because it's so much more light bounces that the computer now needs to process when it's rendering. So this is one way to do it. If you've got a pretty good computer, you can render these out and it will be pretty good. It will look really nice. But if you've got some other software like Photoshop or something, I will usually like to composite my photos in Photoshop or After Effects. What's I think a little bit easier to do is use a mist pass. So if you go over to the view layer properties, you have all these passes selected, and by default it always got this combined pass, a Z pass, and a mist pass. And this one comes unchecked here. So let's actually check this on, and nothing's happened. So to actually see what the effect of this is, while you're in rendered mode, you can hit this shading drop down here, go to rendered pass, combined, and then switch this over to mist. So now you can see this is what a mist pass is, and it's a grayscale image that is showing in black whatever is going to be closest to your camera. So it is like just naturally trying to simulate what atmospheric fall-off looks like. So if you look in real life, way off into the distance, stuff starts to become more and more washed out, kind of less contrasty. And the stuff closer to you is more clear, more defined. This is especially true on days when there's a lot of mist, a lot of fog and stuff in the atmosphere, because this is just what happens when particles of light pass through atmosphere on Earth here. It naturally become less contrasty as you go far away. So this is what a mist pass is here. And there's actually ways to control this. And the way you actually do this, it's oddly enough in the World Properties tab. So if you go to World Properties, now you've got this drop down called Mist Pass. And you can actually control the fall off of this and where this is in your scene, and it gives you this in a distance to the camera. So this is starting at 5 meters away from my camera as the start distance, and is ending at 25 meters away. And actually see this in your viewport. What I think it's helpful to do is go over to your camera. These things are all kind of located in different places. I honestly find it very confusing. So let me break this down just step by step so you can find where these are, because it's not always the most intuitive. So let's just start this over from the scratch here. So in this layer, which looks like kind of a stack of images, is your view layer property, passes mist, and that's what you want to enable is mist. Now go to your camera, whatever your camera is, click on the green camera here, go down to your viewport display, and then show mist. And now you'll see this line appear here. This line is showing you where the start point is for the mist pass and where this end point is, and it's kind of delineated by these two white dots. The white one closest to your camera is the start, the white one furthest away is the end. And now, to control that, go to the World Properties tab and click on this drop down for mist pass, and you can pull this closer and further away. So I'm going to make this start a little bit further away from me, maybe like I don't know, 8 meters away from the camera, 7 meters away from the camera. And let's have this go way off in the distance so we can actually see those mountains start to show up. So you can see, I want this to go even further into the distance. So this is like going to be going to the very back of this last mountain here. So now, when I actually render this out, you want to actually make sure that you're rendering out, it's going to render out the mist pass too. So what's going to happen here is if I just fire off a quick render, let me just reduce the number of samples so this is really quick. If I just fire off a quick render here, this will take just a couple seconds to render. We've got this scene here, but we're not actually seeing our mist pass. So we actually have to go to Compositing and then hit Use Nodes. And now you'll see there's actually a node connection for mist here. And so let me just add in a, using your actually, if you have node wrangle enabled, click Control Shift on this here and click. And you can actually now see this in the background of your screen. If you go over to View, hit Fit, now this is fitting our screen. So we have this viewer node here now, which is nice to use when you're compositing. So now you can drag this mist into the image output, this viewer, and you can see that's what that's looking like there. To actually multiply this in here, we can actually do a mix shader here. So let's mix this with our image and feed this into the output here. Blend mode to screen, that's what it is, that's what I want. Yeah, okay. So now you're seeing the effect of this pretty clearly. So if I were to ramp this up all the way, you can see that the background's completely washed out. If I pull this down a little bit more here, you can see you got a nice atmosphere to it without really killing too much of the detail in that foreground. I maybe want like a little bit more fog in this foreground here just to make it look a little bit more realistic too. So again, we can just adjust this pretty quickly here in our mist pass and maybe have the fall off start a bit closer to the camera, like 3.4 or something. Let's fire off another quick render here. So this is going to render out, and it's now going to add in our mist pass to the scene. You can also composite this in Photoshop. I'll often do that just because I feel like locking this into the image is a little bit tricky, kind of a little bit limiting sometimes, and you can maybe, I don't know, I find the compositing in Photoshop or After Effects is a little bit more intuitive at times than using the nodes in Blender. That's just me. I know a lot of people love doing the compositing in here. But if you wanted to just save out just the mist pass, you can just click this into the viewer layer here, open up our render here. Let's just hit this drop down, and you now have this viewer node, and you can save out just the mist pass that way as well too. But let's just, again, since people don't always have Photoshop, let's just keep all the post-processing in Blender here. So I'm going to go back to the Layout tab here, and let's just kick this back to Combined. So we have our combined scene, and that was actually already looking pretty good. I think you could probably just call it a day if you wanted with that. For the render settings, like I said, I like to kind of keep this maybe fairly close to real time when this is rendering. You don't want this to take so long, especially in cycles. But let's give it like maybe a sampling of like 300 or something like that. And let's just render this out here. So this is looking pretty cool. It's pretty nice. Fairly photorealistic, you know, pretty cool looking thing. It looks like an arch. And this is all done inside Blender in just a couple minutes. You can really quickly get a nice scene doing some kind of cool displacement stuff here with our surface. And now we've added in that mist pass in the background, composited in, and you could just save this one out. This took 22 seconds to render on my machine here. So it's pretty cool. A lot of fun to make this. And actually, if you wanted to, you can actually go to your camera tab here, and then all the way down, there's this color management tab. It's probably a bit cut off here for some reason, my screen recording. But you can add in a bit of contrast to your image if you want. I sometimes like add in like medium high contrast or something, medium contrast, high contrast. Let's keep it at medium high contrast. You can kind of do some exposure adjustments in camera there, which looks pretty nice. Adds like a little bit more detail. This mountain is maybe looking a little bit too uniform there. So let's render this out again one more time. You can see what this looks like. And while this is rendering, I will put in a brief little plug here for my Patreon page. That is been live for a little bit now. I'm starting to get some people signing on to that, which has been really exciting to see. And it's a place for me to kind of be like a teaching assistant in a way. Like you can ask me questions, more pointed questions, and I'll actually make videos to explain your questions in greater detail. There's stuff that's hard for me to explain just in a comment or in a direct message that would actually be helpful for me to actually go through and explain over through a video. You can suggest more tutorials and stuff for me there. There's a couple really cool, more stylized renders and stuff that I've done that I've released on Patreon. I'm starting to release a lot of these displacement maps too. I've released a mountain one recently, and every Tuesday I'm going to start to try to release more of my World Creator displacement maps that you can use to make your scenes, which is really cool and a lot of fun. Feel free to subscribe for more here. I'm going to be releasing a lot more tutorials in 2021. I've really appreciated your support in 2020. It was really cool to see you guys really enjoying the stuff I'm putting out here and learning a lot of stuff for your own projects. It's really exciting for me to see you tagging me on Instagram and all these things. I'm very excited to see what you guys have in 2021 here. And yeah, give us a like, a share, tag your friends, tell your family, and I'll see you on the next one.